you can have meaningful projects, but only if they are, in my terms, manageable, will they redound to your well-being. You have more meaningful projects than you can deal with, and you're ebullient about it. But your life's chaos. It's a complete mess. You're a happy mess, but you're unlikely to be truly satisfied once the detritus is shown. You've got to make that manageable yourself.
What are you really working on? I'm Andrew Soren, and this is Meaningful Work Matters. Today, I'm joined by personality psychologist Brian Little, whose work on personal projects, free traits, and restorative niches offers a wonderfully human way to understand the projects that shape our lives. In this conversation, we explore why meaningful work also needs to be manageable, how people act out of character in service of love or professionalism, and what it means to move from well-being towards what Brian calls well-doing. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Brian Little, welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. It's a delight to have you here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
This conversation is probably going to go into a lot of different places. We've got a lot to talk about today because you've done some really fascinating work, and you've done some work that's kind of tangential to what many of the guests on this podcast have talked about. And so I'm kind of, I think that the headline of this is probably going to be something around well-doing, and not just not just well-being, but how do we actually, how do we think much more holistically? Before we get into it, maybe you could just take a moment to introduce yourself. Tell guests what that you'd like them to know about you.
Sure. I'm a Canadian kid originally, or I guess eternally.
It makes two of us. It's good.
Yeah, right. Born and raised in Victoria, BC, in the first graduating class, maybe even the first male at the University of Victoria.
Wow.
So that was back in 1964. So I'm extremely old. Just to clarify that, so if there are any inconsistencies or a lack of comprehension or comprehensiveness in my
we just blame it on the age. That's fine.
It's completely age, yeah. As an undergraduate, I was bouncing between the humanities and the sciences, and eventually settled on psychology, which was a perfect blend. We'd have neurons in the morning and narratives in the afternoon. And I was all set to go to grad school in neuropsychology. And one day in the library, I stumbled across a mishelved book. I was looking for the stereotaxic atlas of the brain.
As one does.
And found a mishelved copy of George Kelly's Psychology of Personal Constructs. And Kelly had the most original and profound influence in certain sectors of psychology, particularly not in the U.S., quite a bit in Canada, and certainly in England. And his basic premise was that there's this disjunction between us and them, the people we study, and we as scientists, and that this disjunction needs to be expunged, that our subjects, interesting term, isn't it? We now call them participants, but our subjects, to us, the kingly, queenly professors and scientists, are testing hypotheses and are revising those hypotheses in the light of experience. And you, the subjects, are sort of ping pong balls with memories. And Kelly said, no, that's not true. Each one of us is a scientist trying to make sense of life by erecting hypotheses through the personal constructs that we use to make sense, like goggles in the world, and revising them when experience waxes, and generally acting in ways that are, in an important sense, not differentiable from what we do as scientists. So I picked that book. I started reading it, and a few hours later, I got up off the floor of the stacks and I changed I'd already been accepted at Berkeley, and I changed on the way down there. I decided to change my field, and after a few administrative hurdles, I was able to become a personality psychologist. And Kelly was at Ohio State, so I at that point didn't have any contact with them, but later on I did. But that sent me on my professorial career, and so I was being a professor. Still am. I'll always be a professor. I always shall profess. And I started in the UK and sometime in the States and a lot of time in Canada. And so here I am, still professing. My kids told me that, because very early on in life, this sort of rounds out the story of who I am. I spent a lot of time singing in public. And, apparently, according to my sister, apparently from the age of 4, little Brian Little would sing his songs. And my kids told my children are now in their mid-50s. They said that you always have been singing. When you profess, you're singing. And I thought, we talk about meaning and work here.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was very insightful, and in fact, it's true that when I profess, it's a fancy word, isn't it? But when I teach,
it's a beautiful word. Wow.
Yeah. When I teach and profess, it is as though in a lecture I'm creating a song cycle, and there'll be some sad songs always, and there'll be some jovial, almost jubilant songs at other times throughout the course. And I think the more you are able to have whimsy and allegro vivace aspects to your lecture, the more they'll take your serious movements seriously. And so I thought it was quite an insight for my kids, where they said, "Dad, you're just singing again."
That is perhaps one of the most beautiful answers that I have heard to the question of what makes your work meaningful is the opportunity to make song of it.
Yep. Yeah.
The other thing that I think is so apt about that description is that it often feels to me like your work helps us understand the choir within.
What a nice phrase.
And so I suspect we'll get into that today because that's
including the discordant voices.
Not always harmony. There's not always harmony. I can certainly tell you that from my life. You said that you're in this field of personality psychology. Many of the people in this podcast, certainly many of the people in my life, are in positive psychology. And so help us understand, what's the difference between personality psychology and positive psychology, or how do those two things play together?
Yeah, it's important, because I was accused of being a positive psychologist.
You have spoken on our stages at Beyond.
I always disavow my affiliation. At first, it was jocular. It remains jocular. But when Marty and others whom you have intimate intellectual bonds, when they formulated the precepts and the manifesto of positive psychology, those of us in the field of personality psych were saying, "Sorry, aren't you a little late to the show?" we were talking about these issues since the mid-30s. And when you start looking at as I did in my experience as a student at Berkeley, we were looking at creativity. We were looking at the far reaches of human capacity, which would be indistinguishable from the focus of positive psychology now.
Mm.
But we also, speaking of discordant voices in the internal choir, we also looked at the negative things, at the pathologies and and actually how these positive and negative features play out in a kind of interdigital way in things like the highly creative person. The highly creative person is soaring in terms of those positive psychological attributes of reaching and striving and facing the void with courage. But they also are hard to work with.
They face the void.
And they cause you to void.
That's right.
Because they really can be challenging individuals. So personality psychology is basically, to answer the specific question rather than just be illusory about it, I like to say that it explores the way in which each of us, Andrew and Brian and Gary and Melissa who are listening, in what way are they like all other people, like some other people, and like no other person? And Kelly was very much the way in which you are about no other person. In technical terms, which some of our listeners might be interested in, this would be called idiographic, studying the single case rather than how you're like some other people, which would be the typical trait psychologists. So as you've discussed with others on your program, the big five or the big six, or as we now generically call it, the big few dimensions of personality. That's how you're like some other people, how Andrew's like all other ambiverts, or how Dale is like some other introverts. And so at the, like all other people, we postulate these overarching common elements of what it is to be a human, and in contradistinction to the more bestial aspects of our behavior. And so there's some really fascinating work which we can get into recently on mattering, as you know, with Proletansky, but also in a recent book called The Mattering Instinct.
Yes, Rebecca.
That look at what matters about being a human is mattering. Maybe my cat, who I credit with things like insouciance and crudeness, probably doesn't care about whether he's cared about our matters. But I do, and my grandkids do, and the person listening to this does. And if they don't, then that's serious.
One of the things that I think that both personality psychology and positive psychology share, as you say, personality psychology was way ahead of positive psychology in exploring this, is what constitutes human flourishing and how we get there. And I think that one of the things that that I love about your work is that you transcend what I think is often, I guess, sometimes described as the fundamental attribution error when it comes to things like flourishing. That it is, exclusively the self, the individual, that is responsible for that. Or on the flip side, if we were sociologists, that it's exclusively society or our structures that are responsible. And you've done a really beautiful job of building frameworks that say that it's actually like it's yes and, like this is not either or. That we must think about both. Can you tell us a little bit about your social ecological framework?
Thanks. That's a great segue to it. There was a debate within the field of personality that almost made the field utterly disheveled and dispirited. And it was a book written by Walter Mischel called Personality an assessment, and it was basically said that there are no such things as traits, and rather there are people who engage in acts in situations, and the situations are paramount, and this engendered the whole person situation debate. Don't talk about extroversion. Talk about behavior that might be construed as extroverted by other individuals in certain situations. And what most people who, even psychologists, may not realize is that Walter Mischel was, this is in the mid-70s, was a student of George Kelly's. And he not only said that we are influenced by the situations and contexts that we inhabit, but also by the personal constructs or concepts or ideas and viewpoints that we bring to the situation idiosyncratically. And but the person situation debate, as it ended up being called, finally got resolved with, as you say, acknowledgement that we are both driven by things that are relatively stable attributes of the individual. As Gordon Allport, the main founder of personality psychology, would say, these are things that are integumented within the person, so they're inward, and the situation that we're in. What worried me about that was that you ended up having people studying traits and people studying situations. And the interactions between them were, and it gets a bit technical here, really statistical interactions. They weren't living interactions. And I'm just writing a book now where I talk about missing persons, empty environments, and lifeless interactions.
Wow.
And the lifeless interactions were that domain in which I think a social ecological framework starts to fill in matters that really concern us, both as positive psychologists and as personality psychologists and as people. And that is the domain of the doings of daily life. And instead of saying what I call the personal projects, and these can range from take out the garbage to transform Western thought. And they can be individualistic, they can be focusing on self, which is not necessarily a good thing. Or they could be focused entirely on others, particularly in a social ecology, such as you would have in philosophical perspectives like Ubuntu in Africa, where there is really no self other than the embeddedness of others. You are comprised of those others, and your projects may not be carried out in order to satisfy your need to matter, but in order to placate the anger that might ensue from your great-great-great-great-grandfather who upheld certain values that were of concern to your people. So all of this is to say that from taking out the garbage to transforming Eastern thought, there is a panoply, a whole set of fascinating everyday personal projects. And that seemed to pose a methodological challenge. How do we assess personal projects? And you know this because you played with it. It's hard to capture methodologically the capaciousness of the concept because we're so used to taking little tests that say, okay, am I extroverted? Yeah. Am I neurotic? No. And you go through, and at the end of 3 minutes, you get a little thing that shows your profile. Whereas with personal projects, and as you know, we're still working on how to make this exciting instead of tedious to assess. We first elicit the projects you're working on right now in your life, and then get them appraised on various dimensions that are important, all of which we can get into as you wish. And in other modules, we look at how do your projects align hierarchically. We have a couple of ladders, one that says, so your project is take the garbage out. How do you do this? Well, I take the garbage out. So it's at the level of a schedulable act. You'll do it at 10 o'clock. But not if you're in a wheelchair. And now we start to see something that doesn't arise when you're looking at traits very much, which is the affordances of your ecosystem. So now you have to figure out a way of getting down those stairs and putting out the garbage. And every Thursday morning, this is not a trivial pursuit. This is really something that matters and challenges you. And so here is where, as soon as you start talking about a project, you're talking about two things. You're talking about the internal sustainability of it. Do you care anymore about that project? Does it have meaning for you? And the outer face of projects dips us into the ecology, which can range from the microecology of stairs that you have to traverse to the mesoecology of your workmates in your workplace, to the macroecology and beyond, which are the cultural constraints and supports that will make your project be estimable or something you shouldn't even think of pursuing. Want an education? Great. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you a woman?
Right. Are you a black woman? Are you a poor black woman? Right.
Yeah. Or in a culture where women are simply not allowed to be educated. And so the minute you start looking at living interactions instead of statistical interactions, and at the personalized pursuits that give meaning and manageability and structure to a person's life, the minute you start doing that as a personality psychologist, you're doing something that involves talking with architects, geographers, economists, and political scientists and political philosophers. And to me, remember, I was originally interested in the arts and the humanities and the sciences. It all comes down to a movable feast that is very, very exciting. And I have to, I'll tell you about this book. It's not a popular book. It's an academic book. I situate the preface. I tell the readers that I often give talks in large convention centers. And in the cafeteria, and before a talk, I often go around to rooms that are adjacent to where I'm presenting and listen in and take their muffins and have a coffee. And I'm often amazed at how what they're discussing in the economics workshop is so related to human personality. And then I go in and have a muffin at another place. That's why I'm not svelte. And they're talking about the neuroscience or genetics. So I thought for the book, I would invite the reader to be in a cafeteria where you don't know who's sitting next to whom. So it's like the high table in Oxford colleges or even King's College that you're familiar with in Halifax, where you don't know who's sitting next to you, what field they're in. And so the whole book is a series of who am I sitting next to? Oh, yeah, here's how personality can inform what you're doing. And here's how you can inform me about what's going on.
What I'm doing.
And there's in that first chapter, and I'm giving you the preview that nobody else has gotten now. There's somebody in the corner. And I end the prelude by saying, there's somebody in the corner. Rumor has it that he's a French intellectual, Jean-Claude. And he's listening to us very carefully. And then I go on to the other chapters of the book. In the penultimate chapter, is on artificial intelligence and personality. And I say, the rumor was false. It is not Jean-Claude. It's Claude. It's the AI agent.
It's listening in the corner.
That's Claude in the corner. That's him in the spotlight, losing his indifference. I can tell you have REM sleep, right?
Yeah, and I hear it being sung as you.
So all of this is by way of saying that once you start expanding human personality to include the social ecology, which is your original question, all these different fields come in. And we have to have a framework within psychology, within positive psychology as well, in which you can meet these and there's mutual enrichment instead of just talking past each other. So
absolutely. You talked about my alma mater, University of King's College in Halifax.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. One of the things that I loved about the experience of going to King's was it's an extremely multidisciplinary place.
Yeah.
In fact, it's the whole entire structure of King's is predicated on talking about topics and then exploring those topics from 360-degree perspectives. And so one of my favorite classes that I ever took at King's was all about Wagner's Ring Cycle. And as I hear you talk, I'm thinking about, a Wagnerian opera and the complexity of that.
That's a wonderful image. Yeah.
Right. And but the beautiful thing about that course, we studied Wagner's Ring Cycle, which is a 4 opera, saw a circle of 16 hours of opera. But it's one of the most extraordinary feats of Gesamtkunstwerk was the kind of term that Wagner used, which was complete theater. But the idea that opera, had, musicological genius. It had scenographic genius. It had Norse mythology and story genius towards it. But it was also based on Schopenhauer. It was based on philosophy. It influenced, the Nazis and National Socialism. It had all of these tentacles and all of these perspectives, and to exploring the intersection of that from any of those angles misses part of the picture. And I mean, that's kind of what you're describing about us as individuals, is we are Gesamtkunstwerk. We are total people who have to be considered from all of these different perspectives. If you want to try to help figure us out, if we want to try to help figure ourselves out, which is of course extraordinarily complex. Like it's a nightmare, especially if you're going to put 2 people together, or let alone 100, let alone a society.
The world. That's a wonderful reflection. I very much appreciate the Ring Cycle. I've managed to get through 3/4 of it in one sitting there. Well, 3 sittings. But it's very powerful, and it reminds me of a response I had that I found was very very deep when they were playing Wagner in Jerusalem, and the power of music over politics, of seeing the beauty in Wagner, fully aware of the dark side of how it was picked up and exploited, and this clashing of the aesthetic and the ethical is really a fascinating dynamic, which I've been thinking a lot about recently.
Talking about dynamics, and maybe we've zoomed way out. Let's zoom in a little bit, and I want to dig a little bit more into personal projects, because I think that it is so relevant for people listening to this podcast who are interested in meaningful work and the complexities of meaningful work. I think the way that you think about personal projects is really helpful for digging into why meaningful work can be so complex, and in some ways the relationship between meaning and manageability. So maybe you can do. I mean, you've set it up a little bit that a personal project can be anything from taking the garbage out to trying to change Western or Eastern thought. But but tell us a little bit more about personal projects and kind of some of the dimensions of them.
Yeah, sure. There's a formal definition, which I'll state, and I'm glad we set it out with the examples of digging out the garbage and so on. But they're extended sets of personally salient action in context. And so some of those words are extended. The projects take place over time. They're not just a state. They're sets of action. And we may not know what a person's project is if we just observe them, because the personal salient aspect of it is really, really critical. So we can see somebody at work, and we can see them in the cafeteria joking with people. We can see them in the board meeting not speaking up. You can see them in the parking lot not responding when we say, "Hey, how you doing?" And we may attribute that to introverted neuroticism or something like a trait. But we may miss that the project is trying to deal with the fact that my daughter is back in hospital again, and we don't know what's going on. And his project that day, the work is just background. The project is try again to get a better diagnosis for my daughter. Unless you know what a person's projects are at work, you could misconstrue that person. Now, this is not to say that we go around all day saying, "Hey, what are your core projects?" We've got work to do, so we can't do that. But if we have a colleague at work, and we're in the cafeteria chatting with them, and you've got the time, and they seem upset, or they seem over the moon, it's entirely appropriate to say, "What's up? How's it going?" And that is, I think, where you get into the muck of everyday life. That's where you get into the daughter's illness. That's where you get into the I finally got a World Cup ticket, and I'm over the moon, even though it's East Oceania against Left Timor. It's the World Cup, and so I believe that projects are a vantage point from which to enter into a deeper sense of what a person is about. And you mentioned the dimensions, and let me just say a few words about this without getting tediously methodological. Over the years, we've discovered that there are 5 major dimensions of personal projects, appraisal dimensions. When we ask the question, what do you think about this project, and subsequently, how do you feel about this project? And they are meaning, manageability. I'll say a word about each of these: meaning, manageability, connection, positive affect, and negative affect. And these are subtended by dozens of specific dimensions that we use depending on the particular context that we're studying or the particular ecosystem that we're studying. So under meaning, we have such things as, and here is where we start talking eudaimonically about self-identity. To what extent is this project Andrew? To what extent is this project deeply you? And there are some projects that you say are fully me. That's me. That coaching my kids' team, that's the essence of Dave. Or you may say, oh, my projects, to what extent is it me? Well, I wish it were. I haven't had a project that's been me, frankly, since I met Frank. All my projects have been, I love him dearly, but all my projects have been about him and the kids. Yeah. And another one is value congruency, to a fancy term, but it simply means to what extent does this project reflect the things that matter to you in terms of the values that guide your life. Here we would link up with some of the foci of positive psychology and the kinds of Seligmanian character traits that matter to you, honesty.
Yeah, character traits. Sure.
And one of the things that positive psychologists feel a little puzzled about when I talk to them, I actually talked to Penn about this a number of years ago, is that if you look at well-being as an outcome measure, if you're trying to predict well-being, subjective well-being and other attributes of well-being, on these different dimensions, meaning, manageability, connection with others, and so on, positive and negative affect, meaning is the least predictable. Now, to a eudaimonistic, by design, expert like you, that you may say, wait a minute, can we cut this interview right now?
Stop. Don't tell them that, Brian.
But here's the thing. I think you're aware of the work of Ken Sheldon, who used projects and strivings, but he generalized to this conclusion that you can have meaningful projects, but only if they are, in my terms, manageable, will they redound to your well-being. And so that's why I early on talked about the meaning manageability trade-off, and Ken was able to add empirical evidence to that distinction, that your projects may be glowingly meaningful. You have more meaningful projects than you can deal with, and you're ebullient about it. But your life's chaos. It's a complete mess. You're a happy mess. Other people have to work out and pick up your mess. But you're unlikely to be truly satisfied once the detritus is shown. You've got to make that manageable yourself. And that's why, on the other hand, if you're taking out the garbage, picking up the groceries, you're not in a wheelchair. So these are not challenges, but they're just daily things you do, projects as a to-do list. They're pretty meaningless. And if they're phrased at that level, they probably lack meaning. Very manageable. Yeah, schedule them in. They're all what I called earlier schedulable acts, but they're not linked to any value that matters very much. So that's what I mean by a meaning manageability trade-off. Just a brief word on two of the other dimensions. Manageability. The most important dimension there is to what extent is this project likely to succeed? And that is measured, we call that an outcome measure. And it's basically an operationalization of things like Benger's efficacy. It relates also to some of the positive psychology notions of what would you call it? I can't remember which one it is, but it aligns with one of Marty's.
Some of the character traits, some of the, yeah.
Which one? Yeah.
With some of the character strengths, is that what you mean?
No, like, competency, I think.
Oh, competencies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very similar to that. And if we look at depression and well-being and the best predictors from projects analysis of both, the best predictors are efficacy, positively, and stress, negatively. So if you're engaged in efficacious projects that are not stressful, life's good. Depressed individuals tend to be engaged in projects they don't think they're going to succeed. The third dimension is connection. And connection is has to do, I originally called it community, but now I want to generalize it to what extent does your project connect you with other individuals? And to what extent do you get support? But also, to what extent do your projects advance others? And this lines up very much with Adam Grant's notion of to what extent is what you're doing in the service of others' needs, and generative, such that you're not just operating in a kind of solipsistic silo. You're actually engaged with and enhancing the well-being of others. And so we have in some of our versions, I don't think you took this one, the simple two questions: to what extent is this project helpful to you, and to what extent is this project helpful to others? And they're essentially orthogonal, so that you can do things that are helpful to both others and to yourself, or neither, or one or the other. And this seems to be another important pivot point where you can start to have interesting conversations with people. And your concern is with meaningful projects, let's say, for now, at work. And I gave some thought to this when you asked me to come on the podcast, that where can we use the concept of personal projects in a work organization? I've already alluded to how you could use it informally when you're listening to others and finding out what's up with their life and how's it going, how can I help? But when we give our annual appraisals, when you're giving feedback about how your team's doing, we often focus just upon the accomplishments without looking at the projects that led to this. And we often find that there are some employees who may not have, to use a hockey image, may not have scored many goals, but boy, did they get a lot of assists. And those are the Adam Grantish people who are there. And what's important is that these are points. There's some goal scorers, there's some who are fabulous at creating opportunities for others. And the interviews should show that. And so when we look at what are the projects you're engaged in, one of the things that you can ask is, who helped you around here with that project? And how did they help you? And it may be that Marcus doesn't get a great deal of recognition for achieving on his own, but everybody says that team would be let down without him. And so you can ask it as a general question, but by focusing in on a project, it helps you to be much more proactive in designing for strengths in the group. Knowing that Jane is the person who everybody feels comfortable to talk about the problems of the joint project. Everybody else wants to talk about, don't tell me what's wrong, tell me what's right, damn it. Jane's the one who says, oh yeah, that's crappy. What can we do about it? So I don't know whether that helps give some practical examples of how we might use this in a work context, but I hope
it really does. There's something that, as I hear you explain it, is it makes me understand a challenge that really is what spurred this whole entire podcast, what spurred the initial kind of paper I wrote with Carol around this paradox of meaning that, and specifically paradox of meaningful work that often happens where people who are deeply engaged in meaningful work. So, especially people who really see their work as a calling or the projects that they're working on at work as just high moral stakes. This stuff's really important. Yeah. There's all sorts of things. Like, we think that that's a really great thing, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it goes terribly wrong, and we become very attached, so attached, obsessively passionate in ways that we just can't let go. We wind up, eroding other important relationships in our lives because
Yes.
that project starts to dominate rather than other projects like keeping our marriage going. Or we tend to exploit ourselves or put ourselves in positions of exploitation because in reality, the organization isn't set up to make this task manageable. So we have to try to figure out how to just bend ourselves into pretzels in terms of our capacity to make that work. And what that also does, and you didn't talk about these two appraisal characteristics, but I think they're really important, positive and negative affect. Basically, how do we feel about it? Do we feel good or do we feel bad when we are engaging in these projects? And what often happens for people who are engaging in these deeply meaningful things is that it starts to, you maybe come in because it felt really good to work on these things or you thought it would.
Yeah.
And then it starts to feel really bad when you're working on these things. And it starts to just open up this whole world of stress and eventually burnout. And that's often not your fault. Like it's often not the project's fault. It's often the socio-ecological system that surrounds that personal project and the failures to be able to make the context possible for you to balance that manageability and meaning.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One thing we haven't discussed, and I guess we're getting near the end, is that sometimes those projects that challenge us because we have to act out of character.
Right.
And
tell us about that.
When we're talking about burnout, this is probably the thing that people find a shock of recognition at when we talk about it, which is that I'm a professor. I profess. I love professing. I love singing, or I used to when I had a voice. And as a professor, you have to be, as Reb Reveley talked about in his podcast with you, as an introverted person, which I am in spades, you have to act out of character. I can't put on all these conditional qualifying clauses I would as an academic scholar. I can at some point, but when at 8 a.m, I've got to act extrovertedly. I've got to use the humor that is central to my life. And I have to speak up, which I don't usually get me in a meeting, and that's me in the corner. But on stage, it's my song, and I'm going to sing it loudly. But after a period of time, unlike a natural extrovert, it's exhausting.
It's exhausting.
And so I have to find a restorative niche, as I call it, in which you can recapture your original state. Incidentally, a restorative niche for a true extrovert isn't quietude. It's go down and have a party.
Have the party, go to the bar.
Yeah, at the bar, and so there are different restorative niches for different kinds of human propensity. And one might ask, why do you engage in is what I call them, those are free traits.
What do you mean by free traits? Like, tell us
free
why you
trait
call them free
is
traits.
enacting a social script for a trait like acting extrovertedly. But in this case, it's not automatic. It's a free trait. You choose it and craft it for presentational purposes. You can be pseudo-agreeable. You're a naturally miserable person, but it's a job interview. And so when they say, how are you? You're not going to say shitty. You're going to say, fine, thank you. And you? So they're acting out of character in these situations. And it seems that we can engage in these free traits for a variety of reasons. And I think two main reasons would be we do it out of love. We act out of character as an outgoing person because our wife loves to be sociable and you love her. And so, every weekend you have friends over or you go out and it's not really you. You prefer to cuddle up with a book on relationships, but you do it out of love, and we do it out of professionalism. In the case of the introverted professor, or the entrepreneur who has to be up and exciting when really their background is in accounting, and it is a performance, not in the negative sense of, oh, it's just a performance, but in the violin solo sense. It is a performance. And there's standards, and you meet those standards. Those are socially scripted. So here's where the social ecology comes in. If you've never been exposed to how to act like a nice person, you won't be able to be pseudo-agreeable. So these are the complexities that make life complex, Andrew.
Tell us just before we move this topic, because I think it is so relevant. I mean, there's so many of the coaching clients that I have who struggle with, for example, conflict. You know, they're naturally conflict avoidant, and of course, their role requires them to work in contexts where there's a lot of conflict, and so it can be, they are acting out of character. They're successful. It's adaptive. They're doing what they need to do, but it is exhausting.
Yes.
Right. And it does, like, burnout is very real in those kinds of contexts. You keep doing that, and it is exhausting. You've talked about restorative niches, and then they have to be, potentially aligned to, your traits, I guess, to a certain extent, or what is important to you. Can you say anything more about restorative niches? What else is important about restorative niche?
Just when we actually study restorative niches in organizations, and when we were in communication earlier, I mentioned to you before the broadcast that I didn't have any direct experience working with groups with personal projects that I could draw on, lots of research, but not applied activities. One of my doctoral students at Cambridge University, Sana Balsari Pausuli, we mercifully call her Sana BB, she did a fabulous study on firms, entrepreneurial firms, and was asking about the restorative niches they would engage in if they were acting out of character. And one of the most frequently mentioned ones was jogging at lunchtime. I think something like 60% would go jogging. But the extroverts who went jogging would jog in groups, and the introverts would jog on their own. Locked in. And I thought, well, that's a lovely example of how a restorative niche, even though superficially it could be seen as the same, is crafted in order to be consonant with your predilections and your personality.
Okay, so that's at the individual level. I want to kind of go back to the system and just think, put our kind of our feet in the shoes of a manager of people, or a team, or somebody who's trying to lead an organization, to think about how do I manage this complexity of personal projects that is the constituent of all of the people who are potentially working with and for me. What advice would you give them in terms of creating more awareness of personal projects, creating more awareness of when people are acting out of character, and what would you suggest?
It's pretty simple. Just making them aware of these concepts, like what we're doing now. I've talked to many groups about this topic, and pretty invariably, you find that there's this, as I mentioned, shock of recognition, saying yes. And they find their own way of importing it into their ecosystem. So I remember one group of lawyers who said that they had enacted the insights that they had. After meetings, when they would talk to each other, now, these meetings of lawyers are sometimes fractious and very intense, and they would say, they'd have a little period after in which they said, "Did you say everything you wanted to say, Angus? Let's just have a moment's reflection on, did any of us maybe say too much? Because that's our nature, and we would want to control it and contain it a bit. Or is there some who hasn't said enough? Boy, I'm invoking REM a heck of a lot here. Oh no, I've said too much. I haven't said enough. I'm sorry.
It's good. We've got a soundtrack. We've got a soundtrack for the whole entire episode now.
Maybe it's time to end.
That's great. I think it's really helpful, and it's a reminder. And anybody who has ever done work around character strengths, for example, I think would recognize what you're describing. One of the classic character strengths interventions is just, hey, become aware of the fact that there are character strengths and that you have character strengths. So become aware that there are personal projects and you have personal projects. Explore what your personal projects are. Explore what the personal projects are of those around you. I mean, as you say, that can be formal, like, what are things that are important to you, but it could also just be things that you're doing over lunch, the conversations that you're having, the little icebreakers you might be able to do within the context of a team.
It's funny. I'm just thinking now that we need to be really careful that unlike answers to trait questionnaires where you say, I like parties and stuff like that. When you start listing and appraising your personal projects, this is very revealing.
It is.
You're talking about deal with my wife's cancer. This isn't an answer to a question saying, do you feel nervous right now? And I think a really important question is, who wants to know? And so at work, when you say, what are your projects right now? There may be the danger of being too intrusive. And that's something that I think we need to be very astutely aware of. And in other words, we need to have built up considerable trust and to know that the inquiry about your personal projects is done in the context of helping you in any way I can, as a manager, as a coach, for sure. But just algorithmically saying, okay, Andrew, what are your projects? Like, I can't even ask you. I won't ask you now. I would ask you, do you see yourself as an introvert, as Reb asked you? But I won't ask you. Reb might, because he's more direct than I am. What are your projects? I don't want to know your projects. I do, because not on the air, right? And I guess the final thing I will say, because my voice is starting to take umbrage at this, is that for me, human flourishing is the sustainable pursuit of core projects in our lives. And a core project isn't taking out the garbage. It's those projects without which we may wonder whether to go on at all. And we can access those therapeutically. We can access those as very sensitive coaches. And the sustainability of a core project has an internal phase. Do you have the motivation to keep going in that, to sustain it with your own internal results? There's also the social ecology. Do you have the ecosystem that allows this project to continue? And the sustainability. And this is where I talk not about well-being, which is how do you feel, but well-doing. And I resurrected that term about 10 years ago, I guess, from 16th century theology, where it is what I call felicitous action. It is, are you engaged in that which redounds to the benefit of both you and others? And here I hear Adam Grant off in the corner saying, "You've learned well from me, Professor Middle."
Oh, Brian,
Yeah.
my head is swimming with beautiful music. Thank
That's
you.
a wonderful way to end.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.